Commander Jake Miller had seen war in all its ugly forms, and he had watched planets burn and cities fall, and families torn apart by violence that seemed to have no end. And the worst part was that he understood hate now, and he understood it better than he ever wanted to because it lived inside him like a second heartbeat, and it pulsed through his veins every single day, reminding him of what he had lost. His brother Danny had been only 19 when the Elven attack came to Colony 7, and Danny was studying medicine because he wanted to help people, and he wanted to make the universe a better place. And then the dragons came, and they were massive creatures with scales like armor and fire that melted steel and stone alike. And Danny died trying to save children from a burning hospital, and his body was never recovered. And all Jake had left was a melted ID tag and memories that cut like broken glass. That was 8 years ago, and Jake had spent every day since then rising through the military ranks and becoming one of the best commanders in the human fleet. And his ship, the Victory, was known across Allied space as a vessel that never backed down and never showed mercy to the Elven kind. And his crew respected him and some feared him. But all of them knew that when Jake Miller gave an order, you followed it without question. The bridge was quiet that morning, and the stars streamed past the viewports in rivers of light as they traveled through hyperspace, and Jake was reviewing supply reports when the distress signal first came through, and it was weak and fragmented, and the computer had to boost it 3 times before they could make out anything coherent. Lieutenant Amy Cross was manning the communication station, and she was young, only 22, but she was sharp and she had good instincts, and she turned in her seat with a confused look on her face and said, "Sir, we have an emergency transmission coming through, but it is in the Elven language." "Delete it," said Jake, without looking up from his data pad, and his voice was flat and cold. "Sir, the translator is picking up distress markers," said Amy, and her fingers moved across her console, bringing up more data, "and it appears to be a civilian vessel, and life support is failing." Jake felt his jaw tighten, and he set down the data pad and looked at the main screen where a long-range scan was starting to resolve. And sure enough, there was a ship out there, and it was small, and it was dying, and it was broadcasting on all frequencies begging for help. "Let it die," he said. "And they would not help us," Commander, said Amy, and her voice held something that might have been disappointment or maybe shock. "And they are civilians." "They are elves," said Jake, and his hand curled into a fist on the armrest of his command chair. "And elves do not get mercy from me, and not after what they did." "But sir," started Amy. "That is an order," Lieutenant, said Jake, and his voice cut through the bridge like a knife. "And we continue, on course." The bridge fell silent, and the crew returned to their stations, and Jake went back to his reports, but he could feel their eyes on him, and he could feel their judgment, and he did not care because they had not lost what he lost, and they did not understand. 10 minutes passed, and Jake tried to focus on logistics and supply chains, but the distress signal kept playing in his head, and Amy had left the channel open on low volume, and he could hear it now, and it was a voice, and it was female, and she was speaking in broken human standards, saying please and help. And dying, Jake gritted his teeth and forced himself to read the same paragraph 3 times. "Sir," said Amy again, and this time her voice was firmer, "and I have enhanced the signal and cleaned up the audio, and I think you should hear this." "I said no, Lieutenant," said Jake. "With respect, sir," said Amy, "and you need to hear this." And she played the transmission at full volume, and this time the words came through crystal clear. "Please, is anyone there? And this is transport vessel Morning Light, and our engines failed. And life support is critical, and I have 2 passengers aboard who cannot survive much longer, and I know you probably hate my kind, and I know we have done terrible things to your people, and I am so sorry for all of it, but please, these are not soldiers, and they are innocent, and they are just babies, and I cannot let them die. And please, if there is any mercy left in this universe, help us." There was something in that voice that made Jake pause, and it was not the words exactly, though they hit hard enough, but it was the raw emotion behind them, and it was desperation. Yes, but also love, and fierce protective love that reminded him of his mother and reminded him of Danny and reminded him of everything good that war tried to destroy. "The dragons are dying," said the voice again, "and they did not choose this war, and they did not hurt anyone, and they are all I have left in this universe. And please, I am begging, you help us." Jake sat very still in his command chair, and his crew was watching him and waiting, and he could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on his shoulders, like gravity from a gas giant. "Sir," said Amy softly. "And what do we do?" Jake closed his eyes for just a moment, and he saw Danny's face smiling and laughing, and he heard his brother's voice saying that hate is easy, Jake, but being better takes courage. "Damn it," he said quietly, and then louder. "Helm, bring us out of hyperspace and set." "Course for that vessel, sir," said his first officer, Commander Rick Stone. "And are you sure about this?" "No," said Jake honestly. But we are doing it anyway, and get a boarding team ready in full combat gear. And if this is a trap, I want to be ready, eh?" "Sir," said Stone, and he started issuing orders. The Victory dropped out of hyperspace with a shudder that ran through the hull, and the elven vessel appeared on their screens. And it was worse than Jake expected, and the hull was cracked in 3 places. And atmosphere was venting into space, and the ship was tumbling slowly in the void, and all its lights were dark, except for a weak emergency beacon scan for life signs said, "Jake 2 Elven, life forms," said Amy, and both showing elevated stress, and there is also something else, and the computer is having trouble identifying it. But it reads as 2 additional life forms, with unusual thermal signatures. The dragon said, "Jake, yes, sir," said Amy. "And I think so." "Launch the boarding craft," said Jake, and tell the team I want a full report in 5 minutes and be ready for anything." The boarding craft detached from Victory and crossed the distance to the dying elven ship, and Jake watched on the monitors as his team cut through the airlock and entered the dark vessel, and their helmet cameras sent back grainy footage of corridors lit only by emergency strips and frost forming on the walls. The team moved carefully, and their weapons were raised and ready, and then they reached what appeared to be a cargo hold that had been converted into living quarters, and that was where they found her. The elven woman was young, with silver hair that fell past her shoulders and violet eyes that seemed too large for her face, and she was thin and shaking from cold and exhaustion, and in her arms she held 2 small creatures that glowed faintly with inner heat. The dragons were not the massive war beasts that Jake remembered from his nightmares, and they were small and fragile-looking, and their scales shimmered in shades of blue and gold, and they were breathing in shallow gasps, and their eyes were closed. The woman looked up at the human soldiers, and fear flashed across her face, but she did not run, and she did not fight, and she just held her dragons closer and whispered something in Elven that the translators could not catch secure. "Her," said Jake through the comm link, and get them all to medical bay immediately. "Roger that, sir," came the reply. Jake watched as his team gently took the woman and her dragons and carried them back to the boarding craft, and the woman never stopped whispering to her dragons and never stopped holding them close, even when the soldiers tried to help. They brought her aboard Victory and took her straight to medical bay, where Dr. Kelly Shaw was waiting, and Kelly took one look at the dragons and said, "I have no idea how to treat these." The woman looked at Kelly with desperate eyes and said, "I can show you. And please let me help them and her human." Standard was accented, but Clear Kelly looked to Jake for permission, and he nodded once. "Do what you can," he said, and then he turned and walked out of medical bay before he could change his mind, and before he could think too hard about what he was doing and about whether his brother would be proud or ashamed. In the corridor outside, Rick Stone was waiting, and he said, "That was a good thing you did, sir," maybe said Jake, or maybe I just made the biggest mistake of my career, and time will tell. The medical bay of the Victory was not designed for treating alien species, and especially not for creatures that existed somewhere between myth and military nightmare. But Dr. Kelly Shaw was nothing if not adaptable, and she had treated everything from radiation poisoning to exotic parasites during her 10 years in the fleet, and she figured 2 small dragons could not be much harder than the time she had to remove a living crystal from a miner's lung. The elven woman, whose name they learned was Luna Hayes, moved with practiced efficiency around the medical equipment, and she showed Kelly where to place the warming pads and how to position the oxygen flow, and her hands were gentle but sure as she checked the dragon's vital signs using methods that seemed part science and part intuition. The smaller of the 2 dragons was struggling the most, and its breathing was shallow and irregular, and its scales had lost their luster, and Luna bent close to it and whispered in Elven, and tears ran down her cheeks, leaving clean tracks through the grime and frost that caked her face. Kelly found herself moving closer and asking, "What does it need?" "Warmth," said Luna, and her voice was hoarse from cold and dehydration. "And they are cold-blooded. When young, and they need constant heat to survive, and our ship's heating failed 2 days ago, and I have been using my own body heat. But it is not enough. Kelly nodded and adjusted the warming lamps and brought the temperature up slowly. And she handed Luna a heated blanket and said, "Wrap this around them." Luna did, and the dragons seemed to respond and their breathing eased slightly. "You need treatment too," said Kelly, and looking at Luna's blue-tinged lips and shaking hands. "And when did you last eat?" "I do not remember," said Luna honestly. "And maybe 3 days and maybe 4." Kelly brought food and water and watched as Luna drank carefully and ate small bites. And the whole time her eyes never left her dragons. "What are their names?" asked Kelly, and she did not know why she asked, but somehow it seemed important. "The blue one is Sky," said Luna with a small smile, and the gold one is Dawn, and I found their eggs in the ruins of my village after your people bombed it, and their mother was dead, and they were cold and alone, and I was cold and alone. And so we survived together." Kelly felt something uncomfortable twist in her chest, and she said, "I am sorry about your village." Luna looked at her with those strange violet eyes and said, "I am sorry about your colonies, and war makes monsters of us all." They worked in silence for a while, and Kelly ran scans on the dragons and found that their biology was fascinating and complex, and they had a dual circulatory system, and multiple hearts, and their scales were actually living tissue that could regenerate, and their fire came from specialized glands that produced a chemical reaction. "This is amazing," said Kelly, and almost to herself. "They are beautiful," said Luna, and they are kind, and they have never hurt anyone." Kelly wanted to argue and wanted to say that dragons had killed thousands of humans, but looking at these small creatures struggling to breathe, she could not make the words come out. Commander Miller entered the medical bay 3 hours later, and his face was hard and unreadable, and he looked at Luna and then at the dragons, and something flickered in his eyes that might have been anger or might have been pain. "How are they doing?" he asked Kelly. "Stable for now," said Kelly, but they need time and warmth and care." Jake nodded and then looked at Luna and said, "What happened to your ship engine failure?" said Luna, and her voice was quiet. "And I am not a pilot, and I am a caretaker, and I was transporting Sky and Dawn to a sanctuary world where they would be safe from the war, and the navigation system failed, and then the engines, and then everything else." "Why should I believe you?" said Jake, and his voice was cold. "You should not," said Luna, meeting his eyes, "and you have no reason to trust me, and I am elven and you are human and we are enemies, but I am telling you the truth, and these dragons are innocent, and that is all that matters." Jake stared at her for a long moment and then said, "If this is a trick, if this is some kind of trap, I will space you myself." "It is not," said Luna, "and I swear on Sky and Dawn's lives." That seemed to satisfy Jake for the moment, and he turned to Kelly and said, "Keep me updated and assign security to watch her." Kelly nodded, and Jake left. Luna looked at Kelly and said, "He hates me." "He hates what your people did," said Kelly, "and his brother died in an elven attack." Luna closed her eyes and said, "I understand hate, and my parents died in a human attack, and my sister and my friends and everyone I knew, and hate is easy, and forgiveness is hard." Over the next 2 days, Kelly and Luna worked together almost constantly, and they monitored the dragons and adjusted treatments, and slowly the creatures began to improve, and Sky's breathing became stronger. And Dawn opened her eyes for the first time and made a small chirping sound that made Luna laugh through her tears. Kelly found herself talking to Luna during the long hours, and they spoke about their lives before the war and about families they had lost and about the universe they both hoped to see someday, where children did not have to die for the mistakes of adults. Luna told stories about elven culture and their connection to nature and to the creatures they bonded with, and Kelly talked about growing up on Earth and about studying medicine because she wanted to heal, rather than harm. The crew of the Victory was divided about having an elf on board, and some like Amy Cross were curious and compassionate, and others like Weapons Officer Brad Chen wanted Luna locked in the brig or thrown out an airlock. Jake stayed away from medical bay mostly, and he sent reports and checked status updates, but he did not come to visit, and Kelly thought maybe he was afraid of what he might feel if he spent too much time around Luna and her dragons. On the 3rd day, Dawn was strong enough to stand, and the little dragon wobbled on shaky legs and stretched its wings and breathed a tiny puff of flame that was barely hot enough to warm the air. Luna cried when she saw it, and she gathered both dragons close and said, "Thank you to Kelly, and you saved them." and I will never forget this kindness." Kelly felt her own eyes burning, and she said, "You saved them, and you never gave up." That evening, Jake finally returned to Medical Bay, and he stood in the doorway watching Luna play with the dragons, and they were chasing each other around the floor in clumsy circles, and their scales had regained their shine, and their eyes were bright with health and joy. "They look different," said Jake. "They are happy," said Luna, looking up at him, "and they know they are safe now." Jake walked closer, and Sky approached him cautiously and sniffed at his boots, and then looked up at him with intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through his armor and his anger. "She likes you," said Luna. "She does not know me," said Jake. "Dragons know hearts," said Luna, "and not words. And she can tell you are a good person, under all that pain." Jake knelt down slowly, and Sky moved closer, and he reached out carefully and touched her scales, and they were warm and smooth, and the dragon made a soft purring sound. "My brother loved animals," said Jake quietly, "and he wanted to be a veterinarian before he decided on medicine." Luna said nothing and just watched. "These dragons killed my brother," said Jake, and his hand still on Sky's head. "These dragons were not born yet," said Luna gently, and they have killed no one." "I know," said Jake. And that is the problem, and it would be easier if they were monsters." "Yes," said Luna, "and it would be easier if you were monsters too. But you are not, and you saved us when you did not have to. And that means something." Jake stood up and looked at Luna and said, "We reach the station in 2 days, and I will have to turn you over to the authorities." "I know," said Luna. "They will separate you from the dragons," said Jake. "I know," said Luna, again, and her voice breaking. "Unless," said Jake slowly, "and unless I file the right paperwork and call in some favors." Luna looked at him with hope dawning in her eyes. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Jake looked at Sky and Dawn and then at Luna, and he said, "Because my brother would have, and maybe it is time I started being the man he thought I was, instead of the man war made me." "Thank you," said Luna. And I mean it. And thank you." Jake nodded and walked out. And in the corridor he leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. And somewhere in his chest, the hate that had burned for 8 years felt just a little bit smaller. The next morning, Jake sat in his office staring at forms and regulations and legal documents that seemed designed to make simple things impossible, and he was trying to figure out how to classify Luna and her dragons in a way that would keep them together and keep them safe. And it was harder than fighting a fleet of warships. His communication console beeped, and the face of Admiral Lisa Grant appeared on the screen, and she looked tired and older than Jake remembered, and the war had aged. "Everyone Miller," she said. "And I heard you picked up an elven civilian." "Yes, ma'am," said Jake. "Explained," said Grant. Jake took a breath and told her everything, and about the distress call, and about Luna, and about the baby dragons that were not weapons but family, and about how sometimes the right thing and the legal thing were not the same thing. Grant listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "You know, this could end your career." "Yes, ma'am," said Jake. "And you are doing it anyway," said Grant. "Yes, ma'am," said Jake again. She smiled slightly and said, "Your brother would be proud, and I will authorize refugee status for the elf, and will classify the dragons as non-combatant dependents. And you owe me for this, Miller." "Thank you, Admiral," said Jake, and he felt something loosen in his chest. Grant's expression grew serious, and she said, "But Miller, and the war is not over, and there are people on both sides who will not like this, and you need to watch your back." "I understand," said Jake. "Good," said Grant, and Miller, and maybe you are starting something important here, and maybe one act of mercy can ripple out and change things, and I hope so. Because I am tired of this war." The transmission ended, and Jake sat back in his chair and looked at the approval documents that Grant had sent through, and it was done, and Luna and her dragons were safe. And at least for now, he found Luna in the observation deck, and she was standing at the large viewport with Sky and Dawn curled at her feet, and she was watching the stars stream past, and there was something peaceful about the scene, and something that reminded Jake of better times before the war. Its official said, "Jake and you are registered as a refugee, and the dragons are classified as your dependents, and when we reach the station, you will be free to go wherever you want." Luna turned to face him, and tears were running down her cheeks, and she said, "I do not know how to thank you, Already did, said Jake, and just keep them safe and keep being better than this war. I will, said Luna, and Commander, and what will you do? Keep fighting, I suppose, said Jake. And until the war ends, or I do. That is sad, said Luna. Yes, said Jake, and it is. They stood in silence for a while, and then Luna said, Do you want to know how I really ended up with Sky? And Don Jake looked at her and nodded. My village was called Silver Creek, said Luna, and it was small and peaceful, and we had no weapons and no soldiers, and we were farmers and artists and teachers, and then one day, human ships came and they said we were harboring military supplies, and they gave us 10 minutes to evacuate. Were you, asked Jake, and harboring supplies? No, said Luna, and her voice flat, and we were not, and we had nothing but crops and families and children. What happened, asked Jake, though he thought he knew. They bombed us anyway, said Luna, and I was in the forest gathering herbs when I saw the ships, and I ran back, but I was too late, and the whole village was burning, and everyone was dead, and my mother and my father and my little sister, who was only 6 years old, and her name was Star, and she loved flowers. Jake felt sick. I wanted to die too, said Luna, and I walked through the ruins, and I wished the bombs had found me. And then I heard crying, and it was not human crying, and it was something else, and I found a cave, and inside was a dying dragon and a mother who had been protecting her eggs from the blast. And she looked at me, and I swear she asked me to save them, and then she died. So you took the eggs, said Jake. I had nothing else, said Luna, and everyone I loved was gone, and these eggs were the only living things left. And so I took them and I ran, and I survived because they needed me to survive. How long ago was this, asked Jake. 2 years, said Luna, and Sky and Dawn hatched 6 months later, and they have been my family ever since. Jake was quiet, and then he said, I am sorry, and I am sorry for what my people did to yours. And I am sorry for what mine did to yours, said Luna. And war makes us all killers, and even when we do not pull the trigger. The observation deck door opened, and Amy Cross stepped in, and she said, Sorry to interrupt, sir, but we are getting reports from the station, and there is some kind of situation. What kind of situation, asked Jake. Protests, said Amy, and both human and elven groups, and they heard about Luna somehow. And some want her arrested, and some want her protected. And it's getting heated. Jake cursed under his breath and said, How did word get out? We have 300 crew members. Sir, said Amy, and someone talked. Jake looked at Luna and said, This is going to be complicated. My whole life is complicated now, said Luna with a sad smile. When the Victory docked at Station 7, there were crowds waiting, and human protesters held signs demanding justice for fallen soldiers, and elven protesters held signs calling for peace, and the station security was struggling to keep the two groups separated, and the noise was deafening. Jake arranged for Luna and the dragons to leave through a cargo bay exit, and he assigned Amy and 4 other crew members as escorts, and he went himself, because somehow it felt wrong to send her out alone. The group moved quickly through the station corridors and avoided the main areas, but word traveled fast, and by the time they reached the refugee processing center, there were reporters and cameras and people shouting questions. Commander Miller, is it true you saved an enemy combatant? Are the dragons weapons? Why are you protecting an elf? Is this an official policy change? Jake ignored them all and kept moving, and Luna held Sky and Dawn close, and the little dragons seemed frightened by all the noise and commotion. Inside the processing center, a tired-looking official named Helen Morris reviewed Luna's papers and said, Everything seems in order, and you are free to go anywhere in neutral space, and the sanctuary world of Haven has agreed to take you and your dragons. Thank you, said Luna. Helen looked at the dragons and said, They really are beautiful, and I lost my son to a dragon attack 3 years ago, and I hated them for so long, but these little ones, and they look so innocent. They are, said Luna softly. Helen nodded and said, Maybe that is the point, and maybe we have been fighting so long we forgot that innocence exists. She stamped the documents and handed them to Luna and said, Good luck, and take care of them outside the processing center. Jake walked Luna to the transport terminal, and her ship to Haven would leave in 2 hours, and this was goodbye. Thank you for everything, said Luna, and you gave us a future when we had none. You did the hard part, said Jake, and you never gave up on them. Will you be okay? Asked Luna. And with the war and with your pain? I do not know, said Jake honestly, but maybe I will try to be better, and maybe that is enough. Luna reached out and took his hand and said, If You ever need to remember that there is good in this universe and come find us on Haven, and you will always be welcome." Jake squeezed her hand and said, "Take care of yourself. Luna, Hayes, take care of yourself." Jake Miller said. Luna Sky and Dawn chirped and nuzzled against Jake's legs one last time. And then Luna picked them up and walked toward the boarding gate, and Jake watched until she disappeared into the crowd. And even then he stood there for a long time. Amy came up beside him and said that was hard, sir. "Yes," said Jake, but it was right. "Do you think it will make a difference?" she asked, "in what we did?" "I do not know," said Jake, but I hope so, and I really hope so. On the walk back to the Victory, Jake felt different and lighter somehow, and like a weight he had been carrying for 8 years had finally started to lift, and he knew the hate was not gone completely, and it might never be fully gone, but it was smaller now and more manageable, and in its place was something that felt like hope. When he reached his quarters, he found a message waiting on his personal console, and it was from Luna, and she had sent it just before boarding her transport commander Miller. She had written, "And I wanted you to know that Sky and Dawn have chosen you as part of their family, and dragons never forget, and they will carry you in their hearts forever, and so will I. And thank you for showing me that even in the darkest times there are still people who choose light." Jake read the message 3 times, and then he saved it, and he sat at his desk and looked at the photo of his brother that he kept there, and said, "I hope I made you proud, Danny, and I really hope I did." Outside his window the stars burned bright, and somewhere out there, Luna and her dragons were flying toward a new beginning, and maybe Jake thought just maybe there was hope for all of them after all. 3 months passed, and Jake threw himself back into his duties with the same intensity he had always shown. But something fundamental had shifted inside him, and he found himself questioning orders that once seemed clear, and he found himself thinking about Luna and her dragons at the strangest times, and wondering if they were safe and if they were happy on Haven. The war continued, and battles were fought, and ships were lost, and Jake commanded the Victory through skirmish after skirmish, but his heart was not in it the way it used to be, and his crew noticed, and some whispered that he had gone soft, and others said he had finally become wise, and Rick Stone, his first officer, said nothing, but watched Jake with concerned eyes. One evening, Jake was in his quarters reviewing casualty reports from a recent engagement when Amy Cross requested permission to enter, and she looked worried. "What is it?" "Lieutenant asked Jake, sir," she said, "and I have been monitoring news feeds from Haven, and there is a situation." "What kind of situation?" said Jake, and he felt his chest tighten. "The Elven government is pressuring Haven to hand over Luna, and her dragon," said Amy, "and they claim she stole military assets, and they want her arrested and tried for treason." "That is insane," said Jake, "and those dragons are babies, and they are not military assets." "The Elven government claims all dragons belong to the state," said Amy, and they are demanding Haven comply or face sanctions." Jake stood up and started pacing and said, "Can Haven resist the pressure?" "I do not know, sir," said Amy. "And Haven is a small neutral world, and they depend on trade from both human and elven space. And the political pressure is enormous." Jake made a decision, and he said, "Get me a secure channel to Admiral Grant, sir," said Amy. "And what are you planning?" "I am planning to do the right thing," said Jake again. Admiral Grant appeared on his screen, looking even more tired than before, and she said, "Miller and I was wondering when you would call, and I have been following the Haven situation. We need to do something," said Jake. "We cannot interfere in internal elven politics," said Grant. "Those dragons are innocent," said Jake, and Luna saved them from death, and she has done nothing wrong. "I know," said Grant, but my hands are tied, and the human government is not willing to risk diplomatic relations over 1 elf and 2 dragons. "Then I will go," said Jake. "What?" said Grant. "I have leave time accumulated," said Jake, "and I will take personal leave and go to Haven, and I will help Luna." "Miller," said Grant, "and that is a bad idea. And if you go there and if you interfere, and you will be acting as a private citizen, and the military will not protect you." "I understand," said Jake. "You could be arrested," said Grant, "and you could be killed, and you could start an interstellar incident." "I know," said Jake, but I cannot sit here and do nothing. And not after everything." Grant sighed and said, "You are a stubborn fool." Miller, yes, ma'am, said Jake. She was quiet for a moment and then said, you have 4 weeks personal leave and use it well. And Miller, yes, ma'am, said, Jake, come back alive. She said, and that is an order. Yes, ma'am, said Jake with a small smile. 2 days later, Jake boarded a civilian transport to Haven, and he traveled under a false name and wore civilian clothes, and he felt strange without his uniform and without the weight of command on his shoulders. But also somehow freer. Haven was a beautiful world and all rolling green hills and clear blue oceans and forests that stretched to the horizons. And it was a place untouched by war, and Jake could see why Luna chose it. He found her sanctuary on the northern continent, and it was a sprawling compound of natural habitats and caves and open sky. And there were dragons everywhere, and not just Sky and Dawn, but others, and at least 20 of them ranging from babies to adolescents, and all of them rescued from war zones, and all of them finding peace. Here Luna was in a large meadow when Jake arrived, and she was teaching a young red dragon to fly, and the dragon was clumsy and kept tumbling in the grass, and Luna was laughing and encouraging it, and the sound of her laughter carried on the wind. Then she saw Jake, and she froze, and for a moment she just stared, and then she was running toward him, and Sky and Dawn were racing behind her, and they had grown so much, and they were twice the size they had been 3 months ago, and their scales gleamed in the sunlight. Jake said, Luna breathlessly, and what are you doing here? I heard you were in trouble, said Jake, and I came to help. You should not be here, said Luna. But she was smiling, and this is not your fight. You made it my fight, said Jake, and when you trusted me with your family, Sky and Dawn reached him, and they jumped and circled and made happy chirping sounds, and they remembered him. And Jake knelt and let them nuzzle against him, and their scales were warm and smooth, and they smelled like sunshine and grass. They missed you, said Luna. And so did I, Jake stood and said, tell me what is happening. Luna's smile faded, and she said, the Elven Council wants the dragons back, and they claim I am a thief, and that all dragons belong to the state and must be used for the war effort. And they are threatening Haven with trade embargoes and possibly military action if I am not extradited. That is insane, said Jake. That is politics, said Luna, and the war is going badly for my people. And they are desperate, and dragons are powerful weapons, and they cannot afford to lose any. What will you do? Asked Jake. I will not give them up, said Luna, and her voice fierce, and I will not let these innocent creatures be turned into weapons, and I will die first. You are not going to die, said Jake, and we will find another way. What other way? Said Luna. And I am one person with no power and no influence, and the Elven Council does not care about what is right. Then we make them care, said Jake. How? Asked Luna. I do not know, yet said Jaken, but I will figure it out. Over the next week, Jake worked with Luna and the small staff of volunteers who ran the sanctuary, and they tried to find legal options and diplomatic solutions, and they reached out to neutral governments and to peace organizations and to anyone who might help, but the pressure kept building, and Haven's government was starting to crack. Then one evening, as Jake sat with Luna watching the dragons play in the twilight, he had an idea. What if we tell the story? Said Jake. What story? Asked Luna. Your story, said Jake, and the real story, and about Silver Creek, and about finding Sky and Dawn, and about choosing to save life instead of take it. And what if we show the universe that these dragons are not weapons, but individuals with personalities and families? How would we do that? Asked Luna. We broadcast it, said Jake, and we send it to every news outlet and every social platform and every government in human and elven space, and we make them see what we see. Luna looked at him and said, that could be dangerous, and both our governments hate the truth. I know, said Jaken, but maybe there are enough people who are tired of the war and enough people who want something better. They spent 3 days preparing, and Jake recorded interviews with Luna, and she told her story, and she talked about losing her family and about finding the eggs, and about choosing to nurture life in the middle of death. And Jake filmed the dragons playing and learning and being innocent and joyful. And he showed the sanctuary and the other rescued dragons and the volunteers who had dedicated their lives to protecting them. Then they sent it out, and they broadcast it on every channel they could access. And they titled it Simple and Direct and the Truth About Dragons. The response was immediate and overwhelming. And within hours, the video had been viewed millions of times, and people across human and elven space were talking about it, and some called Luna a hero, and some called her a traitor, and some called Jake a fool, and some called him brave, and the debate raged across the networks. But something else happened too, and other people started coming forward, and humans who had lost family to dragon attacks but who did not want more violence, and elves who were tired of the war and who wanted peace, and soldiers from both sides who said they were done killing, and parents who said they did not want their children to grow up in a universe defined by hate. A movement started and small at first but growing, and people calling themselves the Haven Coalition began organizing, and they demanded that both governments end the war and stop treating dragons as weapons and recognize the sanctuary as neutral ground. The Elven Council tried to suppress the movement, but it was too late, and the truth was out and public opinion was shifting, and even within the council there were voices calling for change. Jake and Luna watched it unfold and barely daring to hope. You think it will work? Asked Luna. I do not know, said Jake, but at least we tried. 2 weeks later, Admiral Grant contacted Jake on a secure channel, and she said, Miller and you have started something big, and the human government is willing to negotiate, and the Elven Council has agreed to talks. Jake felt hope surge in his chest, and he said, What about Luna and the dragon? Safe for now, said Grant, and the Council has agreed to a temporary cease, and they will not move against the sanctuary, while negotiations continue. That is something, said Jake. That is everything, said Grant, and you did good, Miller, and you did really good. Thank you. Admiral, said Jake. Now, come home, said Grant, and we need people like you helping to build the peace. Jake looked at Luna and said, I will, and soon. The peace negotiations took 6 months, and they were held on Haven because both sides agreed that neutral ground was necessary, and Jake was asked to attend as an observer and witness, and he stood in the grand hall where representatives from human and elven governments met for the first time in a decade without weapons drawn and without threats flying. Luna was there too, and she had been asked to speak about the sanctuary and about the dragons and about what peace could look like, and she was nervous, and Jake could see her hands shaking as she prepared her statement. But when she stood before the assembly, her voice was strong and clear. These dragons, she said, and gesturing to Sky and Dawn who stood beside her, and they are not weapons, and they are not tools, and they are living beings with emotions and bonds and families, and for too long, both our species have treated them as objects to be used and controlled and destroyed, and it is time we do better. She spoke about the sanctuary, and about the rescued dragons who had known only violence and pain, and about how they were learning to trust again and to play and to be what they were meant to be, and she spoke about the volunteers, both human and elven, who worked together to care for the creatures, and about how that cooperation proved peace was possible. When she finished, there was silence, and then slowly, one of the elven representatives stood, and her name was Council Member Vale, and she was old, and her face was lined with years of war, and she looked at Luna with tired eyes. I lost 2 sons to this war, she said, and both were dragon riders, and both believed they were serving a greater purpose. And now I wonder what purpose justifies so much death and so much pain. Paused and then continued, and I see these dragons and Sky and Dawn, and they remind me of the hatchlings my sons cared for. And they remind me that before we turned them into weapons, they were beautiful and innocent, and we took that from them, and we took it from our children too. Another representative stood, and this one was human, and an older man named Delegate Chen, and he said, I commanded forces that fought against dragon attacks, and I have seen the destruction they can cause, and I have nightmares about fire and death, but I have also watched the footage from the sanctuary, and I see something different here, and I see hope, and I see a chance to end this cycle. The negotiations were difficult, and there were setbacks and arguments and moments when it seemed like everything would fall apart. But slowly progress was made, and both sides began to recognize that the cost of continuing the war was higher than the cost of peace. Jake spent his days in strategy sessions and his evenings at the sanctuary, and he had taken a temporary leave from active duty to help coordinate security for the talks, and also because he could not imagine being anywhere else. One evening he found Luna sitting by a pond watching Sky and Dawn swim, and they had grown enormous, and they were now the size of horses, and their scales shimmered in the fading light, and they moved through the water with grace and power. They are magnificent, said Jake, and sitting beside her. They are happy, said Luna, and That is all I ever wanted for them. You did it, said Jake, and you saved them. We did it, said Luna, and correcting him gently, and I could not have done this without you. Jake was quiet, and then he said, I have been thinking about what comes next. What do you mean? Asked Luna. When the negotiations end, said Jake, and when peace is signed, and what will you do? Stay here, said Luna, and the sanctuary needs me. And there are so many dragons still suffering in war zones, and so many that need rescue and protection. And what about you? Asked Jake, and what do you need? Luna looked at him and smiled and said, I have what I need, and I have sky and dawn, and I have purpose, and I have hope. And that is more than I ever thought I would have. Jake nodded and said, I have been offered a position and working with the new Joint Peace Commission, and they want me to help coordinate humanitarian efforts, and including support for sanctuaries like this. That is wonderful, said Luna. It means I would be stationed on Haven, said Jake, and at least for a few years. Luna's eyes widened and she said, you would stay? If you do not mind the company, said Jake. I would like that very much, said Luna and Jake, and thank you. And for everything. They sat in comfortable silence and watched as Sky and Dawn emerged from the pond and shook water from their scales and came over to nuzzle against both of them. And the dragons made contented rumbling sounds, and their warmth seeped through clothing and skin and straight into the heart. 3 months later, the Treaty of Haven was signed, and both human and elven governments agreed to a ceasefire, and to the establishment of demilitarized zones, and to the protection of dragon sanctuaries, and to a dozen other provisions that would take years to fully implement, but that represented real progress. The signing ceremony was held in the sanctuary's Great Hall, and representatives from both species stood together and signed the documents, and cameras captured the moment for history, and outside the dragons flew in formation, and their scales catching the sunlight and creating a display of color and beauty that seemed to bless the occasion. Jake stood with Luna and watched as Sky and Dawn led the flight, and they were fully grown, now, and magnificent and powerful. But they had never been used for war, and they never would be. Is this real? Asked Luna, and her voice full of wonder. And is it actually happening? It is real, said Jake. And you made this happen. We made it happen, said Luna and all of us together. After the ceremony, there was a celebration, and humans and elves mixed together cautiously at first, and then more freely, and Jake saw old soldiers from both sides talking and sharing stories, and beginning the long process of healing. Amy Cross had come to Haven for the signing, and she found Jake and Luna, and said, Sir, and I mean, Jake, and this is incredible, and I never thought I would see this day. Neither did I, said Jake. You started this, said Amy, and when you answered that distress call, and when you chose mercy over hate, I almost did not, said Jake, and I almost let her die. But you did not, said Amy, and that is what matters. That night, Jake and Luna walked through the sanctuary grounds, and the dragons were settling down for sleep, and their gentle breathing and occasional chirps created a peaceful symphony. I have something to tell you, said Luna, and her voice nervous. What is it? Asked Jake. The council has asked me to speak at universities and at schools and at public forums about the sanctuary and about peace, and they want me to be an ambassador of sorts. That is amazing, said Jake, and you will be wonderful at it. I am scared, said Luna, and I am just one person, and what if I fail? And what if the peace does not last? Then we try again, said Jake, and we keep trying until it does last, and you are not one person. Luna, and you have all of us, and you have the dragons, and you have people across the galaxy who believe in what you are doing. Luna stopped walking and turned to face him, and she said, and do I have you? Always, said Jake, and for as long as you want me. She reached out and took his hand and said, I lost everything in the war, and my family, and my home, and my innocence, but I found something, too. And I found purpose, and I found hope, and I found you. Jake squeezed her hand and said, I was drowning in hate, and I thought it was the only thing I had left of my brother. And then I heard your voice across the stars, and you showed me that there was another way, and you saved me, Luna. And just as much as I saved you. They stood together under the stars, and 2 humans and 1 elven woman who had found each other in the midst of war, and who had chosen to build something better. Sky and Dawn came over, and they curled around Jake and Luna, and their warmth enveloped them, and their presence was a promise that some bonds transcend species and conflict, and history years would pass and the peace would hold, despite challenges and despite those on both sides who wanted to return to war, and Jake and Luna would work together to expand the Sanctuary network and to rescue hundreds more dragons and to prove that coexistence was possible. They would face opposition and threats and moments of doubt, but they would never give up, and they would build a life together filled with purpose and hope and love. And it all started because one commander heard a cry across the stars and chose compassion over hate, and because one woman refused to let innocence die in the darkness. The sanctuary on Haven became a symbol of what the galaxy could be, and children, both human and elven, would grow up visiting it and learning that dragons were not monsters, but magnificent creatures deserving of protection and respect. Jake would eventually write a book about his experiences, and it would be called Hearing the Stars, and it would inspire a generation to choose peace over violence and understanding over hate. Luna would become one of the most respected voices for interspecies cooperation, and her speeches would move millions, and her work would save thousands. But their greatest achievement was not the treaties they helped negotiate or the awards they won or the changes they inspired. Their greatest achievement was proving that even in the darkest times, even when hate seems inevitable, and even when loss has broken your heart, it is still possible to choose light and to choose mercy and to choose love. And under the skies of Haven, surrounded by dragons who knew no war and walked beings who had once been enemies but who now were family, Jake and Luna built a future that honored the past while refusing to be defined by it. The stars that once carried cries of distress now carried songs of hope, and the universe, though still imperfect and still struggling, was just a little bit brighter because two people chose to answer when someone needed help.